Thank you. Merci. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Today I'm here to talk to you about Health Canada's authorization of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, developed in partnership with Oxford University, as well as the Serum Institute of India's version of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is sponsored in Canada by Verity Pharmaceuticals. After in-depth reviews of the evidence, we've determined that these vaccines meet the department's stringent safety, efficacy, and quality requirements. I'll start by providing information about the authorization of the vaccines, followed by some information on other COVID-19 vaccines currently under review, and I'll close with updates on our ongoing monitoring of vaccine safety. The AstraZeneca vaccine and the Serum Institute of India's version, sponsored by Verity Pharmaceuticals, are the third and fourth COVID-19 vaccines to be authorized by Health Canada. As with the other vaccines authorized under the interim order, Health Canada conducted independent and thorough scientific reviews of the data to determine that the vaccine's benefits outweigh their risks. Health Canada conducted its review of the AstraZeneca vaccine in collaboration with the European Medicines Agency as part of its open process. This initiative makes it possible for trusted regulatory authorities outside of the European Union, such as Health Canada, to work together and share information throughout the review process. Health Canada's authorization of the Serum Institute of India product relies on the assessment of its comparability to the AstraZeneca-produced version of the vaccine. Detailed information on Health Canada's review of these and all COVID-19 vaccines is available on the COVID-19 Vaccines and Treatment portal at covid-vaccine.canada.ca. While the first two COVID-19 vaccines authorized in Canada are mRNA-based vaccines, the AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute of India products are viral vector-based vaccines. Viral vector vaccines use a harmless, modified version of a different virus, the vector, to deliver instructions to our cells. The cells begin to make proteins from the virus that causes COVID-19, which then prompts the body to develop an immune response. The virus used in these vaccines is an adenovirus. Adenoviruses are one category of viruses that can cause common cold-like symptoms, and there are many different types. People have been using these types of viruses in vaccines for decades. It's important to note that these viral vectors do not cause illness. These vaccines are indicated for adults 18 years of age and older. Ongoing studies are expected to provide more data about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines in other populations, such as children. While limited information from clinical trials is available to calculate the efficacy in people 65 years of age and over, Health Canada's authorization for a broad adult population has taken the available data on immune responses into consideration, and there is emerging promising evidence that is beginning to be reported from real-world use of the vaccine. Health Canada authorizes products based primarily on the information submitted by the manufacturer. These are 2-dose vaccines, with the second dose being given between 4 and 12 weeks after the first. Evidence suggests that efficacy increases with longer dosing intervals. As with other vaccines, common side effects include pain and tenderness at the injection site, headache, muscle pain, fever, and chills. The majority of adverse reactions in clinical trials were mild to moderate in severity and resolved within a few days. Based on combined data from clinical trials, the vaccines, following the 2-dose regimen, were shown to be 62% effective in preventing symptomatic cases of COVID-19 overall. This exceeds the efficacy standards issued by Health Canada, the World Health Organization, and other major regulators like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Health Canada is working with all manufacturers of authorized COVID-19 vaccines, as well as the manufacturers of those under review, to assess their efficacy against variants of concern. At this time, we consider the available vaccines to be effective, and ultimately the benefits of vaccination, even with reduced efficacy, outweigh the risks of no vaccination. I know that there are likely some questions regarding the efficacy results of the viral vector vaccines compared to those reported for the mRNA vaccines made by Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. Each vaccine has unique characteristics, and Health Canada's review has confirmed that the benefits of the viral vector-based vaccines, as with the other authorized vaccines, outweigh their potential risks. The AstraZeneca and Serum Institute of India vaccines can be transported and stored at refrigerated temperatures between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius, giving greater flexibility in how they can be distributed across Canada. The authorization of additional vaccines that meet Health Canada's rigorous safety, efficacy, and quality standards provide additional tools to fight this pandemic as quickly as possible. In addition to the 4 authorized vaccines, Health Canada has 2 submissions under review. I will now take a couple of minutes to provide an update on those 2. As you may know, Health Canada received a submission from Novavax on January 29th for its protein subunit-based vaccine. The department has also received a submission for the Janssen adenovirus-based vaccine, which has been under review since November 30th. We are expecting to reach a regulatory decision on these vaccines on a similar timeline as other international regulators, such as the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency. This is all very promising news. Having additional vaccines from different manufacturers can help to get more people vaccinated sooner and also offers more vaccination options. With 4 vaccines now authorized, Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada are continuing to actively monitor their safety in the real world. We monitor for any adverse events or side effects in collaboration with the provinces and territories, international partners, and the manufacturer. As with all vaccines, we will take action if any safety issues are identified. Ongoing reporting of any potential adverse effects is critical to support this monitoring, and Canadians can report any possible side effects to their healthcare professionals. For the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines, reported adverse events to date are not unexpected and have not altered the benefit-risk profile of either of these vaccines. Now that more vaccines are authorized for use in Canada, I know people will want to know when they will begin receiving them. A vaccine rollout briefing providing more information on supply and logistics will occur at 11:30 today, immediately following this to provide you with this information. Today's authorizations will provide jurisdictions with more options at a time when supply is limited. While this is good news, we must continue to do our best to follow public health guidelines. We're all in this together and need to remember to keep wearing a mask, washing our hands, and keeping our physical distance. Thank you. Merci.
Bonjour. Merci de vous joindre à nous ce
Good
matin.
morning. Thank you for being with us this morning. Today, I'm here to talk about the certification by Health Canada for the AstraZeneca vaccine against COVID-19 and developed in partnership with Oxford University and produced by the Serum Institute of Canada and sponsored in Canada by Verity Pharmaceuticals. After a thorough review of the data, we've determined that the vaccines meet the department's standards for safety, quality, and efficacy. I'll begin by talking about certification of these vaccines, and then I'll talk about the other vaccines which are still under review, and I'll conclude with an update with the ongoing safety monitoring of the vaccines. AstraZeneca, Oxford vaccines are the 3rd and 4th vaccines against COVID-19 certified by Health Canada. As with the other vaccines certified under the interim order, the department conducted an independent and exhaustive review of the data and has concluded that the benefits outweigh the risks. Health Canada has conducted a review of AstraZeneca's vaccine with the European Medicines Agency within the Open Project, which allows regulators outside of the EU, such as Health Canada, to work with and exchange information throughout the scientific review. The certification by Health Canada for the product developed by the Serum Institute of India, the detailed information of Health Canada's review of this vaccine and all vaccines against COVID-19 are on the website at vaccines-covid.canada.ca. The 2 first vaccines against COVID-19 certified in Canada were RNA messenger technologies, and the AstraZeneca vaccine are viral vector vaccines. Viral vector vaccines are based on a modification of a virus to send instructions to cells, which start to create COVID-19 proteins, which helps the body develop an immune response. It's an adenovirus, which is a type of virus which can cause symptoms resembling cold symptoms, and there are many different types of these vaccines. And manufacturers have been using these types of vaccines, rather viruses, to develop vaccines for many years, and they don't cause illness. And they're indicated for adults over the age of 18. And current studies should give us more data on the efficacy of this vaccine in other groups, such as children, even though there is limited information on data for this vaccine for people aged over 65. Data by Health Canada for the adult population has taken immune response data, which is already available, and promising data is coming out from real applications of the vaccine. Health Canada has used information from the manufacturer. 2 doses should be administered. The second one should be administered between 4 to 8 weeks after the first one. And there are indications that the efficacy of the vaccine increases the greater the time frame between administrations. Side effects such as headaches, muscle pain, fever, chills are the main side effects. And most of these side effects, which came out in clinical trials, disappeared after a few days and were not serious. So these vaccines, following data from the clinical trials, have shown an efficacy rate of 62% in mitigating COVID-19, which increases the standards set by Health Canada, the World Health Organization, and many other regulators, such as the FDA in the U.S., have certified this vaccine. Health Canada is working with other organizations and with producers to determine the efficacy of vaccines against the new variants. At this point, we believe the vaccines are effective against the new variants. And even though they are less effective against the new variants than the original COVID-19 vaccine, it is still safer to take than not to take. Each vaccine which has been approved has its own characteristics, and Health Canada has confirmed that viral vector technologies and mRNA technologies have more benefits when applied, and the new vaccine can be stored at between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius, which will be easier to distribute throughout Canada. We have therefore, with the certification of this vaccine, we have another tool in the toolbox against COVID-19. Health Canada has received 2 more requests for authorizations, and I'll speak to those now. As you might know, Health Canada has received a request for certification on January 29 by Novavax for its vaccine. The department has also received a request for certification from Janssen, and Health Canada has been reviewing that review since the end of November. A decision should be made in a similar delay to that taken by other regulators, such as the FDA or the European Medicines Agency, and this is good news. Having more vaccines from different manufacturers will allow us to vaccinate more people more quickly and provide more vaccination options. Since there are now 4 certified vaccines, Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada will actively monitor their effectiveness. We are on the lookout for any side effects in cooperation with provinces and territories, international partners, and the manufacturers. As is the case with all vaccines, we will act if adverse effects are identified, and we will keep on focusing on the monitoring. Canadians can report any adverse effects should there be any. With regard to Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, the adverse effects which have come out so far have already been known and do not affect the risk advantage analysis. I have no doubt that people will now want to know when they can get access to vaccines. An information session on that will follow at 11:30 with government representatives, and you can ask questions about the logistics of the rollout at that point. Today's certification will provide provinces and territories more options at a point where the offer is limited. Despite the good news, we still have to do our best to follow public health guidelines. We are all in the same boat. We're all in this together. We have to keep on wearing a mask, wash our hands, and respect physical distancing directives. Thank you.
We will now open the line to questions. Vous pouvez poser vos questions dans l'une des deux langues officielles. We ask that you limit yourself to one question and only one follow-up. For those asking questions in the room, we ask that you make your way over to the freestanding mic. As usual, we'll start on the phone with 3 questions. Operator, over to you.
Thank you, merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. Et la première question est de l'Inadib, la presse canadienne. La parole est à vous.
Oui, bonjour.
Dr. Berthiaume, I would like you to talk about the efficiency of 62% for the vaccine, which was just approved. Is that an average for the entire population, including those over age 65? Is that the efficacy for people only between the ages of 18 and 65? Thank you for the question. The 62% efficacy rate applies to everyone who participated in the clinical trials. So people who had enough COVID symptoms to take part in the efficacy review, fewer than 10% of people who took part in the trials were over the age of 65. Follow-up question. Now, 62% is lower than the efficacy rate for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. You said that there are pluses and minuses for each of these vaccines. Why would I want to take the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is less efficient than Moderna or Pfizer? Answer. Well, thanks for the question. I think you're not the only one to wonder that. Please keep in mind that to be effective, a vaccine needs time to become, for a person to become, to develop an immunity. At this point here, we need a greater variety of vaccines offered to Canadians. Health Canada standards, which are based on international standards, was aiming for a 50% efficacy rate. So 62% is good to help control the pandemic in Canada, and it offers an additional tool as well. That vaccine has a simpler has easier logistics in terms of distribution, so it'll be easier to bring it to more Canadians who want the vaccine. So having this vaccine on top of the others will help to increase population immunity. Every time a new person becomes vaccinated, the transmission of the virus decreases. So this new vaccine is an additional tool. Lastly, if you look at all the people who have received the AstraZeneca vaccine in clinical trials, there was no single case of hospitalization in that group versus those who were in the control groups. So when we conduct these studies, we look at cases of symptomatic COVID. And another interesting effect is that when you get a vaccine, it brings down the number of hospitalizations. And in clinical trials, AstraZeneca showed exactly that. So none of the people were hospitalized after they had received this vaccine. So it clearly is an advantage, and it is a good thing, and comes on top of the other tools we have to fight the pandemic. Thank you, Dr. Berthiaume.
Merci, thank you. And the next question is from Marika Walsh of the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you so much for taking our questions. Dr. Sharma, can you give us some more information on how Health Canada is planning to advise prioritizing who gets what shots now? I understand that AstraZeneca's vaccine is approved for everybody over 18, but will there be advice on prioritizing for example, Pfizer shots for people over 65?
Thanks for the question. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the regulatory decision, it really is based on the science and the evidence, all the information of the clinical trials, what information we have that went into the review, that all gets summarized, put into the product monograph so people have that available to help equip them making those decisions in terms of which vaccines to use. In terms of recommendations of one vaccine over another or recommendations for certain populations, that's what we really rely on the National Advisory Committee on Immunization to do. And so they will look at this evidence, and they actually have looked at a lot of this evidence already, and then provide recommendations to the provinces and territories about the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Serum Institute of India vaccine in the context of the other vaccines that have been authorized. And we're expecting that advice to come fairly shortly, likely early next week.
And can you clarify the dosing that you're recommending with the AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute shots? You said that there was signs that it was better efficacy with a longer interval, but previous reporting has been that it's a 28-day interval. So what is the interval Health Canada is recommending?
So for the AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute of India vaccines, it's the same recommendations. So it is a 2-shot vaccine. So we're recommending, and each of them is 0.5 mils. So you get one vaccine, and then the second dose would be between 4 and 12 weeks later. And the reason that we're putting that in the product monograph is because that's what was reflected in the clinical trials. It was quite varied. In some of the clinical trials, the second dose didn't come until up to 26 weeks later, but the majority of the data of the studies that had sufficient numbers to be able to draw conclusions from, the dosing was between 4 and 12 weeks. Now, within that range, that 4 to 12 weeks, there are some trends in the data that show that closer to the 12 weeks, you could actually see a better immune response, so more effectiveness or more efficacy. Now, the issue for the trials is that the numbers are not sufficient to recommend only that timeline. And so again, we've reflected all of the data in the studies, but again, so that could be that second dose is 4 to 12 weeks, but there is evidence to show that on the far end of that, so towards the 12 weeks, it might actually provide more effectiveness. We certainly are looking to more studies and more real world information. And if we get any more information, of course, we will update the information for the vaccines.
Certainement. Alors, la question, c'était...
So the question was on the efficacy. Most results from clinical trials had to do with the time between the administration of the vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine. So it should be administered 4 to 12 weeks after the first day, even though we didn't have data to define the best time to administer the second dose. The data nevertheless showed that if the second dose was administered closer to 12 weeks after the first one, it was more effective than if it was administered 4 weeks after the first one. That's what we took from the data.
Thank you. Dr. Sharma, did you want to add something?
Because there was a request to repeat Dr. Berthiaume's other
If you want to go
answer
ahead.
in English. So just the question was around the efficacy of AstraZeneca. And I think the comment was, briefly, why would you use it if you've got other vaccines that are higher efficacy? So I think just to put it in context, the first thing is that we don't have head-to-head trials. So we don't have trials for vaccines that directly compare the mRNA vaccines and the viral vector vaccines. So it's difficult to draw those direct conclusions. Secondly, when we look at the clinical trials, they are all designed slightly differently. So where their endpoints are, how they're tracked, how they're measured. So it is difficult, again, to compare them directly. The numbers that I think are really important is if we look at all the 5 vaccines, whether they've been the ones that have been authorized already or the ones that are under review. So I'm talking about the Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Novavax, and the Janssen vaccines. If we look at all of those, I think the key numbers that are important is that if you look across all the clinical trials of the tens of thousands of people that were involved, the number of cases of people that died from COVID-19 that got vaccine was 0. The number of people that were hospitalized because their COVID-19 disease was so severe was 0. The number of people that died because of an adverse event or an effect of the vaccine was 0. So in the areas where we're really looking to prevent serious illness, prevent hospitalizations, and of course, prevent death, all of these vaccines are good. Now, we are still have some that are under review, so they haven't been authorized yet. But I just wanted to caution against this sort of good or bad vaccines. If there's a vaccine and it's been authorized by Health Canada, it means that it's met standards. If we look at the standards that we look at for effectiveness, we're saying that it should meet at least 50%. If we compare that to the influenza viruses that we authorize every year, if you look back, for example, just to last year, the effectiveness of the flu vaccine against the most common strain was about 64%. Across to the next common strain was about 54%. So 64% and 54% approximately. So these vaccines do have a use. We are getting more information from real world use. So in some cases, with an increased interval, the efficacy might be much higher. We have real world evidence from Scotland and the UK for people that have been, dosed that have been over 80, and that has shown a significant drop in hospitalizations to the tune of 84%. So, the idea is to have a suite of vaccines that are available. I think Canada is hungry for vaccines. We're putting more on the buffet table to be used. I think we really need to see what the availability is. Provinces and territories need to look at their demographics, their epidemiology, and decide which vaccines are most appropriate for the populations. But this is another option, and it is a good option.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. We'll move over to the next question on the phone. Operator.
Thank you. La prochaine question est de Hélène Buzetti, les coop de l'information. La parole est à vous.
Oui, bonjour. J'aimerais simplement revenir à un commentaire que vous avez fait.
Good morning. I'd like to come back to something you said about Novavax and Johnson & Johnson. You said that you will come to a determination in the same time frame as other regulators like the FDA and the European Medicines Agency. We know that the U.S. today might come to a decision on Johnson & Johnson next week. So are you saying that in Canada, we will make a determination right after the Americans? Answer. Thank you for the question. As we said, at the moment, we are aiming to make determinations on those 2 vaccines in the same time frame as our international regulators. We can't give you a specific date at this time because we have to review the data. It is ongoing, including discussions and adjustments. These happen until the very last minute. We know when a determination is made only the day before. So all I can say is that the review is going well, the data are solid, and we expect to make a determination in the same time frame as other organizations, but we can't be more specific than that now. Next question. So you're saying about the same time frame or the same dates as the Europeans and the Americans? Is that what you're saying? Well, that's what we're currently aiming for. Perhaps I can add something here. With regard to the Janssen submission, we are looking at the manufacturing process data today. And as for Novavax clinical trials, We'll be reporting results at the beginning of April.
I'm sure I said something wrong in French. So I think the question was just getting a little more precision in terms of the timelines for the two vaccines that are under review. So that's the Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine and Novavax. And as Dr. Berthiaume has noted, both of those reviews are progressing well. We had noted that we're expecting to have decisions on those in line with the other major regulators. With respect to Janssen specifically, that review is progressing very well. We're expecting to get some additional information on manufacturing today, but other than that, that file is pretty much complete. So now it's going through the review of that data. Now, the time that it takes to make a final decision really depends on a lot of that work in the final stages, the work on the product monograph, the terms and conditions, the risk management plans, the monitoring. So that's for Janssen, but again, progressing well. For Novavax, they have a large phase 3 clinical trial that is ongoing. Initially, we thought we might get results in May, but they've now said they would likely be reporting out those results around the beginning of April. So that would be a significant amount of information in terms of the safety and the efficacy for the Novavax vaccine.
Thank you. We'll now turn to the room for questions. First question, CBC.
Hi, Dr. Sharma. Tom Perry from CBC. You touched on this in your earlier answer, but I'd just like to know, given the questions about how well the vaccine works for people over 65, why did you decide to approve it for all age groups?
So, I mean, as we do all the reviews, it's really based on the evidence. If we look at the clinical trials, and, in the product monograph, there is a line that says that the data from clinical trials for people 65 and over is limited. And so just to give you that sort of perspective, when we look at, there were about 4 trials that were done, 2 that were large enough to draw conclusions from. Of those 2 trials, there were about 9.7% of the subjects that were 65 and older. And that's why we said the data from the clinical trials is limited. Now, unlike the other vaccines, when we did the authorization, we have, millions of doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine have been administered. And we are now starting to get real-world evidence. So there is evidence to show that in the older age group, it could be, it would be effective especially at preventing severe disease and hospitalizations. But again, that's real-world evidence. It's not the same kind of quality of evidence that we've seen in the clinical trial. So when we did the authorization, the question is, for somebody 65 years of age and older, would the benefits of getting the vaccine versus not getting the vaccine, could the benefits outweigh the risk? And the answer to that was yes, based on all the information that we have. Now, the separate question is, if you are in that older age group and there are other vaccines available, which would be the best for you? And that's not just for that age group, that's really for all of the age groups. And again, that recommendation for, the overall recommendation will come from the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, but then it really goes to provinces and territories for them to look at what their situation is in their provinces and territories and how they feel that they can best use these vaccines. We know that there are benefits to having fridge-stable vaccines. We've done a lot for the frozen vaccines. We've bought freezers. I think the provinces and territories have done incredible work in terms of ramping up and delivering those vaccines. But it is more complicated. So, I think there will always be a demand for fridge-stable vaccines that are easier to transport and easier to administer as well.
Certainement. Alors, la question était qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire de l'efficacité?
So the question was on the efficacy for those age 65 and older.
À l'intérieur des 2 études qui ont servi à la détermination de
studies helped to determine the efficacy of 62% for Johnson & Johnson, and there was a certain percentage of people age 65 and over who took part in the clinical trials. So the data was not could have been more fulsome, but we determined that the vaccine is indeed effective in people aged 65 and over, but because of the limited number of participants of age 65 and over, the data in that regard was limited. But the vaccine has been administered in many other countries, included in England, in elderly populations, and the vaccine seems to protect against serious COVID-19 cases. So when all the data were collected, it seemed clear that the AstraZeneca vaccine has no identified risks, and many people of all age groups received the vaccine and showed benefits. Again, a great deal of data was brought together, and administering the vaccine offers protection for people aged 65 and older, and it helps to protect against the more severe effects of COVID-19.
Yeah, and just on the other vaccines, if the U.S. FDA is talking about Janssen today, if their approval comes, say, this weekend, should we be expecting Canada, are you going to follow suit? Do we expect approval of that vaccine in the coming days? I'm just trying to get a clearer idea on timelines.
Yeah, and we don't have a timeline on that, and it's primarily because we're still expecting some information to come in from the company. So, and it's specifically on manufacturing. So, we would need to get that review. So we will not see in the next couple of days an authorization for sure, because we're expecting just to get that information today. But again, it can go quite quickly if that information is all in order. If we have to go back and forth with the company to ask any questions or work through the details, it might take a bit longer. And then I just wanted to add sort of to your other question. I know we were really talking about effectiveness or efficacy in those older age group. The other thing that we found in terms of the real world data is that there weren't any other safety issues that came up in those older age groups. So I think, we always have to balance the work of the vaccines and what it can do, but also to make sure that we're also looking at the safety side. So no unexpected safety issues, adverse events that came up in those older age groups from the real world evidence, and sort of no increased risks that we saw.
Thank you. Next question, CTV.
Hi, Dr. Sharma. Mackenzie Gray with CTV. You'd spoken previously about how we were expecting the AstraZeneca vaccine to be approved in the coming days, yet it took a number of weeks from when you'd said that to now to get approved. So I'm wondering what took so long, and was the concern around the waiting about the AstraZeneca vaccine's effectiveness against variants?
So this is the risk of saying a few days. So I think we should go back to our usual comments where we just say soon or something else. So, I think there's a few things. One, it's just a reminder that when we, normally we did vaccine reviews, it took almost a year. It's about 2,000 hours of review time. I think, it's good that we're all getting used to these shorter timelines. But the thing is that, so at that point in time, we were, in the final stages. There are a lot of things that happen in those final stages. So agreeing on the wording that goes into the product monograph to make sure that it correctly reflects the information. We ended up having real world evidence that came out that we didn't know was going to come out. So we needed to incorporate that in the review. There's a to and fro with the company in terms of getting those responses. We need to finalize all the terms and conditions as well. We were looking at 2 vaccines at this point in time as well, because of the Serum Institute of India vaccine that relies on that data. So there were a lot of things that were happening. So it was just a few extra days compared to in the next few days.
Just on behalf of all journalists, we like when you say days, so please keep saying that if we're going to be that close. But I want to turn to Moderna. I know in the U.S. that they have applied and I think received approval to change the number of doses per vial from 10 to 14. Has Moderna talked to Health Canada about making any changes similar to that?
Right. So the Moderna change is interesting because I think, there was also the Pfizer change where we had the number of doses. Moderna is a little bit different. The submission that was in the United States was doing 2 things. It was increasing the volume per vial and then saying that you can extract more volume. So it's not using the same volume and then saying you can extract more. And they were looking at between sort of going from 10 doses per vial to potentially up to 15 doses per vial. Now, we have not received that submission yet from Moderna, but they have indicated that they do intend to file that. The reason that they might, that people are considering that is because with all the shortages in terms of materials, there are potentially also shortages in the raw materials that go into the vaccines. One of those things is the glass that goes into the vials. So if there's room in the vials, if you can potentially safely put more doses in per vial, that's something that they're considering. But we haven't received that submission yet in Health Canada.
Thank you. One more question in the room. CP.
So Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press. I'm just wondering if you could walk us through a little bit more about the efficacy numbers. We talk about 62% effective, but that it's 100% effective against death and serious illness or hospitalization. Just wondering if you could actually sort of explain to people a little bit more clearly what we mean by the 62% and sort of how that number is calculated.
Thanks, Mia. So the 62% came from 2 large studies that had, when we looked at all of the people that received 2 doses, and they received 2 doses from between 4 and 12 weeks apart on that sort of second dose. So when we look at those numbers, and there are about 4,400 in each group. So about 4,400 in the group that did get the vaccine, and then about 4,400 that didn't get the COVID vaccine. So when we look at those, in the people that did get the AstraZeneca vaccine, there were 27 cases of COVID-19. None of those were serious, but there were 27 cases. In the group that did not get the vaccine, there were 71. So when we compare that, that's where we get the 62.1% efficacy. Again, nobody got in the vaccine group had serious disease. Nobody was hospitalized. There were no deaths. So that's where you can get the 100%. People might be quoting 100%. Within those categories, we might see, depending on how you look at the data, depending on when the data lock points are, some regulators were looking at November data, some people were looking at it from December. So there's lots of ways to slice and dice the data, but the 62% came from comparing those 2 groups that got 2 doses, and the second dose was between 4 and 12 weeks apart.
Certainement. Alors, si on élabore un peu comment on calcule 62%
if we talk about how we got to that 62% efficacy rate for AstraZeneca, we use studies which had included over 4,000 participants with COVID, and there were a similar number in the control group, and we study 1 dose, 2 doses, and then after a couple of weeks, we look at the effect of doses administered at 4 to 12-week intervals. So we looked at that interval. So 2 weeks after the second dose, we look at that group. So there were 27 cases of COVID-19, which were confirmed by a test, again, in those which had been vaccinated, versus 71% in the control group. And again, we had the same number of people in each of these groups. So when you look at the ratio, it came out to a 62% efficacy rate. So a greater number of people had been protected against COVID.
Between the 2 vaccines we're talking about today, the Serum Institute versus AstraZeneca, I think it's just about the manufacturing, but is there any other difference that people should know about between the 2? Should people actually care whether they get which one they get?
Okay, so for all intents and purposes, they're the same vaccine. So, but they are manufactured. There are some slight differences in terms of manufacturing, and the places that they are manufactured are different. So the analogy is a bit like the recipe. So the recipe for the vaccine is the same, but they're manufactured in different kitchens. Now, AstraZeneca wholly owns and operates the kitchens in Europe, in South Korea, and in the United States. They have licensed that recipe to the Serum Institute of India, and they own and operate their kitchens in India. So it's the same recipe, it's the same vaccine, it's based on the same trials, but there are slight differences in manufacturing. So when we looked at the Serum Institute of India vaccine, we had detailed information on the manufacturing processes. There was a small clinical trial that was done in India as well, so we looked at that, and we were really looking at the comparability. So are the results that we've seen for the AstraZeneca vaccines comparable to the ones that we would expect to see for the Serum Institute of India one? And the answers are yes. So the meals that are coming out of the kitchens are the same, they taste the same, they're basically the same, but it's really about where they've been manufactured and the processes.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Time is really flying. We have time for one more on the phone and then one more in the room, and then we'll end the technical briefing. Operator.
Thank you, merci. La prochaine question est de Mélanie Marquis de la presse. La parole est à vous.
Question. Good morning. Many of my questions have already been put, but I'd like to come back to Dr. Bertillon on the 65-year-olds and more. France and Germany are not advising that AstraZeneca be administered to 65-year-olds and those who are older. But you are not giving out the same directives. You're not saying that AstraZeneca should not be given to those aged 65 and older. Answer. Thank you for your question. I believe that the regulatory agencies in Europe have done so on the basis of data they received. As for Health Canada, our position is not different from that of the World Health Organization or other regulators or organizations. Clearly, the numbers we've received can be interpreted differently. The number of people exposed in those age 65 or older cannot lead us to conclusive results in the clinical trials. But if you look at other trials, immunogenicity trials and another study which yielded observational data. In Scotland, they had access to the medical files of basically all of their citizens, and they looked at those who received the vaccine and how many of those a month after they received the vaccines had been hospitalized. And as it turns out, those who had received the AstraZeneca vaccine, that hospitalization rate had fallen by 95%, and those age 80 or over who had received AstraZeneca, again, that hospitalization rate fell by 80%. So the vaccine clearly has been administered to thousands of people around the world. We know it's a safe vaccine. There are no risks. And we are encouraged by the data, which seems to indicate that it is good for people who are older, and that's why in Canada we're making the recommendation that people age 65 or older should receive it because of the advantages of receiving it. Thank you. Is there a follow-up question? No, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you, Mélanie. Last question in the room. Question. I will follow up to the question my colleague just asked. 62% efficacy rate. Is that for all age groups, or those 65 and over are protected at the rate of 62%? Answer. When we analyze subgroups, and you're obviously dividing up the pie into smaller pieces, and it becomes harder to determine exactly the efficacy rate for each subgroup. But if you look at the overall efficiency, it stands at 62% for all people aged 18 and over. As I said, 10% of the 4,400 people who took part in the clinical trials, 10% were aged 65 and older. So it all points to the efficacy of AstraZeneca. But at this point here, we can't compare how effective AstraZeneca is for different age groups. But we don't expect it to be very different for those who are 65 and older than for the general population. As well, as we said, there are studies coming out which seem to confirm, and I'm talking about real-world studies, is that AstraZeneca does indeed prevent the severe effects of COVID-19. Is AstraZeneca less effective in those 65 and older? Answer. In fact, our data do not allow us to reach definite conclusions on the efficacy rate in older persons. We can't say it's less effective for that group. We would need more data to determine the efficacy rate of AstraZeneca for different age groups. We can't make that breakdown at that point here. We have more data for younger groups, and therefore, for those groups, there are more conclusive statistics. Right now, for AstraZeneca, we have a general effectiveness rate. As I said, there are clinical trials, and with AstraZeneca, the original clinical trials were redesigned. At first, one dose was administered, and then after that, a second dose was administered. Sometimes there was a loss of follow-up in some of these studies. Some participants may have dropped out. So many people took part in these clinical trials, and a lot of time elapsed between the start of the trial and the end of the trial, but things can happen in between. So it's hard to give you more specific information on how effective AstraZeneca is in those 65 and older. But the immunogenicity rating is good, and generally speaking, we have seen that AstraZeneca has helped people produce antibodies for those who have received the vaccine. So again, this also applies to those 65 and older who have received the AstraZeneca vaccine, and there is scientific data which shows that it is indeed an effective vaccine, including for people aged 65 and older. The National Immunization Working Group will have to look at Canada's vaccine portfolio, which populations are to be vaccinated when, and this task force, this group, will make recommendations to the provinces and territories as to the most effective rollout of all of these vaccines. At the end of the day, AstraZeneca is a good option for vaccination amongst Canadians. Question? If you receive AstraZeneca and the efficacy rate is lower, and then 4 or 5 months later, when more vaccines are available, could people who have received AstraZeneca the first time receive a dose of another vaccine for the second dose? Answer, that's a very good question. And in fact, scientists are looking at that right now from a regulatory point of view. Health Canada's position is that the vaccines should be administered as directed on the label. And therefore, we should continue with that approach. If you've received one vaccine first dose, you should get the same vaccine for the second dose. So if you've received AstraZeneca the first time, should you receive another vaccine which uses another technology? We don't have an answer to that yet. The question was inaudible. Answer, a lot of research is being carried out right now, and research is being carried out on the efficacy of all vaccines and how effective they are against the new variants. Soon we'll have access to more data to answer that question more specifically. At this point here, we cannot answer the question, but what we can say is that there are many scientists around the world who are looking at that issue now and who will try to find the answers. However, at this point here, the recommendation is to use the vaccines as prescribed on the label, and Health Canada's position and Canada's immunization task force position might change in light of new studies which will be coming out.
Maybe I'll just do not all that, but part of it in English. The questions were really around mixed dose schedules. So that would be to use a viral vector vaccine and an mRNA vaccine or vice versa, and then boosters. And so I think basically when we're looking at the authorizations for the vaccines, they really are based on the clinical trials. In those clinical trials for the 2-dose vaccines, it's first dose and second dose of the same vaccine. Now, when we're looking beyond just the clinical trials for the authorization, there are some studies that are showing promising data if using a mixed schedule. So again, either first viral vector, then mRNA, or first mRNA and then viral vector. And in those, at least laboratory studies, it's showing that potentially you could get even a better better immune response than if you're using just a regular schedule. There is a trial that's ongoing in the United Kingdom of about 800 people looking at those mixed schedules. So certainly we're looking to that to see if there is evidence from real clinical trials to show that that would be the case. And so, you know, the idea is, I think for a lot of people would say, get one dose in, and then when it's time for the second dose, you can sort of evaluate what the next step would be. The second part of this is really around the emergence of variants and variants of concern that potentially could have an effect on the effectiveness of the vaccines. We have asked all of the manufacturers of the vaccines to continue to provide data to us on the effectiveness of their vaccines against the variants. There's lab studies where you take antibodies from people that have been vaccinated and the variants and see if there's an effect. There's some limitations to those. So it's really about having more data from the information as we roll out. Now, if the companies find, if we are in a place where we find that we don't have enough effectiveness in the vaccines against the variants, there can be other studies to either do what we call a strain change, sort of similar to what we do with the influenza vaccines, where you can make those chains. It's a bit of a vaccine redesign. Then the question is, for those vaccines, would you give just a booster dose for somebody that has had the same vaccine? Would you give a booster dose for somebody who's had a different vaccine? Would you restart the whole series of vaccines? So all of that, when we get to that point, would have to be supported with science and evidence. Now, if companies are coming in with new versions of the vaccines, they wouldn't have to provide the full data package as if it was a brand new vaccine that we've never seen before, because we have a lot of information about the platforms, the manufacturing, the safety, et cetera. So it would be an abbreviated data package, but whatever that data would be would have to match what it is that they're saying that the redesigned vaccines would be used for.
Thank you very much, doctors. That'll be all for today's technical briefing. Please note